Can you talk to me about Chinese cranes? This is something that,
Yeah,
again, you sent me
yeah.
the
Here,
news.
it's an interesting story. I'll tell you about both the cranes and the transformers, etc. In 2021, the Director of National Intelligence issued a cyber assessment, and again, it was public. Normally, you would think this not cyber, but you know, a defense assessment, if you will. Normally, something like that coming out of DNI would be classified. This wasn't. It was basically dealing with renewables. But in there, it said that DNI viewed Chinese transformers, inverters, and circuit breakers as being cyber vulnerable, okay, and with cyber issues. Now, this is the Director of National Intelligence putting this out in 2021. Now, in 2019, going back, and then I'm going to jump forward, a large U.S. utility, in fact, it was a DOE-operated utility, had ordered a large Chinese transformer. We're talking 400 tons worth of large.
Okay, yeah.
And when it was delivered to the site, the electrical and mechanical engineers, not cyber, electrical and mechanical engineers, found extra electronics inside that transformer. Now, this isn't the cyber people doing their games. This is stuff that was visible as they're installing the transformer. So they basically, mentioned it because it wasn't supposed to be there. Next thing we knew, in 2020, May 2020, President Trump had issued an executive order on Chinese equipment for the grid, basically saying don't buy anymore. But here's what was so interesting about it. In that executive order, it laid out all of the equipment that was covered. It was all of the control systems. It was all of the hardware. What was explicitly excluded in that executive order was all of the networking. Isn't that amazing?
It's interesting because
they bypassed it.
Huawei, I feel like that's a 2020.
Yes, it's sort of concurrently. Huawei was a chip issue. This is a 400-ton large electric transformer issue. Okay, and it wasn't just chips. I mean, you couldn't see the difference between a Huawei chip and, say, an Intel or Motorola chip. This is stuff that the engineers saw. Now,
it's interesting that it was that obvious. There was no attempt to.
So here's what happened. Two things, and this is not political, so this is just factual of what's going on. Number one of those Chinese transformers, and we're not sure where it came from, was sent to the Sandia National Laboratory to be torn apart and examined. The report that was issued on this Chinese transformer was classified as top secret. Think about that for a minute. This is a transformer you would see at your substation. And it was classified as top secret. Read between the lines. Scared to death of what was found. And realize there's well over 350 large Chinese transformers in our grid today. Okay? Now, bad thing. Again, not being political. When President Biden came in, what did he do? He basically suspended all of President Trump's executive orders. This was one of them. As a result, the utilities have bought, I think, something like 125 or 150 more of those Chinese transformers since. Okay, now fast forward to what you talked about. In February, end of February, President Biden issued an executive order on Chinese port cranes because they were finding, tell me if this sounds familiar, they were finding things in the port cranes that shouldn't have been there.
And like these are port cranes that are in our ports.
Yes, like 80% of the port cranes in the U.S., and I'm not sure in Canada, but certainly in the U.S., are Chinese port cranes. Okay? I forget the exact number, but I think it's 80% or more. And so the concern was they had cellular modems and sensors and other things in there that shouldn't have been there. That were never, okay? So it turns out that in 2021, I have a picture of a ship, Chinese ship, on its way to the port of Baltimore with the Chinese port cranes. The Dolly, the ship that hit the Key Bridge, was quote unquote unloaded and loaded at the dock in Baltimore by these Chinese port cranes.
And the tie here is like, I've never been to a shipyard and seen, but I'm imagining that between the ship and the cranes, there's obviously some interconnectability. If you're talking cellular and modems, there's ways to
absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing that's interesting that I didn't put in the blog is normally that ship would have only been in port for part of a day. That ship was there for 2 days because they were having quote unquote power issues. Had nothing to do with fuel because they didn't take on any fuel in Baltimore.
Interesting.
Now, I want to be clear. You know, am I saying that the Dolly was a cyber attack? I'm not saying that. Am I saying that what happened to the Dolly could, operative word, could have been caused by a cyber attack? The answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah, again, when you start looking at all these different control devices,
you keep on going. That ship was built in South Korea. Its maintenance is now done in China. I told you DNI basically said there are issues with Chinese circuit breakers. There is a good chance, I haven't seen the details of the Dolly, I don't think anybody is going to, but there's a pretty good chance because they're really looking at the propulsion system. And here's the other point. A ship is a power plant with rudders. A ship is also a microgrid. Everything that happens on land, what I was just talking about, how all things, that's what happens on a ship. It's just, it's not fixed. It moves. So
it's a big problem set.
Yes, and it's
it's almost unimaginable just the issues because that stem from this.
It's a Manhattan Project size issue because our entire, and by the way, there is nothing unique about the United States. Everything we're talking about here is generic to the world. Remember, Siemens, with Stuxnet.
Right.
Siemens is a major international supplier. Siemens is Germany. Okay. And by the way, again, you realize with Stuxnet, those were Siemens controllers. Those were the exact Siemens controllers that Idaho did the assessment with. The exact same. Honeywell is here. It sells all over the world. Emerson is here, sells all over the world. ABB is Switzerland. Schneider is France. Yokogawa is Japan. They all sell all over the world. There's nothing, and by the way, and they're all major supporters of